Welcome back, my friends. Welcome to Knowledge Unbound. We're at episode 9. Can you believe we have been on this journey for quite some time? And I really enjoy every minute I've got to spend with you. Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for a Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Thanks as always to my longtime producer, Mrs. Segev Amasai, computer engineering major, class of 2025. Got that right this time. So this week we have a really interesting conversation. We'll be talking to Maisha Moses, the executive director of the Young People's Project. And I'm not going to spoil the conversation by telling you what it is. We have a lot to talk about. There are ways in which this project connects to civil rights and what we know about justice and what the kind of education people deserve. And I'll just let our guest, Maisha Moses, just share that story with you. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. So what I do is, I don't read people's CVs. I don't, say all the things that you've done, right? I told the audience that you are the executive director of the Young People's Project. So let's start with that. Tell us what the Young People's Project is, how long it's been in existence, what you all have accomplished, and what would you like people to know about it?
Okay. So the Young People's Project is a youth math literacy organization. And in a very broad sense, we structure opportunities for young people, generally speaking, who are struggling with math to help each other. And we work primarily with students who are in communities who, for the purposes of their educational opportunity, are being sorted to the bottom. And so typically that's Black students, Latino students, in lower income urban communities, also white students in lower income rural communities. So that tends to be our target population. We grew out of the Algebra Project.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. So my dad started the Algebra Project, Bob Moses, and he has a civil rights legacy and history. And so the Algebra Project was an extension of his civil rights work in the 1960s, organizing for the right to vote in Mississippi with Black sharecroppers. And so what they found, what they learned in Mississippi was that you had to get, you had people all across the country at all levels of society working on the right to vote, but that when the sharecroppers actually got organized and organized themselves to start to demand their right to vote, then the country shifted.
Why was that a pivotal point? Why was the sharecroppers organizing a thing that created momentum? Well,
the narrative in the face of an oppressive system was that, the people themselves were apathetic. Not that there's something wrong with the system that is preventing them from being able to exercise their natural desire and natural right to vote, but that the reason they're not voting is because they're apathetic. They're the problem. And it's sort of the same narrative.
They didn't care or something.
They don't care. Yeah. And it's sort of the same narrative in education and in schools, that the children don't really care about their education, that they don't want to work hard, and that their families and their communities are too dysfunctional for the schools to really make a difference.
So going back to the sharecroppers, and just for listeners' benefit, Robert Moses was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that operated mostly in the 60s. People know Ella Baker and Stokely Carmichael. I would believe he was in SNCC as well.
Yeah.
He's from Trinidad, by the way.
Yeah.
And all the work they did about getting people out to vote.
Yeah.
Were they the ones who organized the sharecroppers that then created the momentum?
Yes, it was the young college students. So it was the SNCC workers. Many of them were college age, college students. They left college, dropped out to do this work. And it was really the sit-in movement that sparked the energy or unleashed the youth energy.
In Greensboro.
Yes, in North Carolina. And then, but that energy in Mississippi was channeled around the right to vote. And it was Ella Baker who sent my dad sort of into Mississippi to connect with some of the longtime NAACP leaders who had been in the trenches, for decades. And one of them, AMZ Moore, said that, well, if the young people are gonna organize in Mississippi, we need them to work on voter registration.
So, and we're going to get back to YPP in a second, but I think this foundation is important. When SNCC went into Mississippi, my understanding, and I'm drawing this from Bob Moses' book, Radical Equations, that there was a little bit of tension between how the young people sort of approached civil rights and getting out to vote to the ways in which some of the more established workers were around like notions of leadership, right? And I think the phrase I remember being used was grassroots leadership, and investing in people who kind of do little things, but little things are different ways of showing leadership.
Yeah.
To what extent they had to navigate that, and how was that handled?
So in Mississippi, they were really influenced by Ella Baker, who helped to found SNCC. She helped.
And she led the Freedom Party, right?
The MFDP?
Yeah.
No. Well, the MFDP was led by, it was local Mississippi folks that led MFDP, and that was a couple of years later. That was sort of the culmination of their work in Mississippi. Ella Baker helped to get SNCC off the ground, and she sort of went up against the SCLC leadership around, do the young people need their own space that they own and that they control and that they lead, they make their own decisions. And so I think that was the tension. And her idea about grassroots leadership is sort of encapsulated in her quote, "Strong people don't need strong leaders." And that there's leadership everywhere, right? There's leadership in the community.
Right.
In every community.
Right.
And it's the job of organizers to bring folks together and to create conditions and to organize processes that enable that leadership to emerge.
So was that then the philosophy, that kind of belief in everybody's ability to lead, but also be, agentic, right? Have their own kind of control over their futures.
Yeah.
Is that the philosophy that allowed the galvanization of the Black sharecroppers, right?
Yes.
That then led to kind of a more national movement?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe sticking with Bob Moses for a second. I know he, at some point he left SNCC, went on and did a PhD in math eventually, and taught math in Tanzania and Cambridge. Could you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah. So he had actually, he had started his PhD in math and actually in philosophy. And he was studying he was studying the philosophy of math. And then his mom passed. And the family situation was such that he had to leave school. And he got a job teaching math in New York, and he was helping to take care of his dad. And it was during that time of his life that the sit-ins happened. And he was so moved by the sit-ins that he went down to experience them, take a closer look at them, and then that's what, led him to Mississippi. And then when that phase of the movement work, SNCC's work in Mississippi, was changing and sort of coming to an end, he left the country, and he ended up for a little while in Canada, and then found his way over to Tanzania. And he had been not so much I can't remember if he had filed official conscientious objector status to the Vietnam War, but he had been able to defer his draft because he was a teacher and because he was teaching mathematics. Or because he was a student. And so he had, every time he had been called up, he had these legitimate deferments. And I think at one point he did say that he had, written a paper about being a conscientious objector. But at that time, this was, I don't know, mid-60s, and he had no more deferments.
Okay.
And so, so that's why he left the country. And at that time, Tanzania, I think there were, a handful of Black expatriates, like movement folk who were going to Tanzania, living, working, trying to think about, organizing over there.
Because even Stokely went to Africa eventually.
Yeah. And I think SNCC had organized, they had done stuff in Ghana, but I think they had also organized something in Tanzania. Like a couple years prior, a group of SNCC folks had gone over to Tanzania. And Tanzania was one of the few countries that was, I think, offering a level of citizenship to American expatriates. So anyway, he ended up in Tanzania, and I was born there, and my two brothers and my sister.
Where are you in the?
I'm the oldest.
You're okay.
Yeah. So there's four of us, all about 2 years apart. So me, my brothers, Omo, Taba, and Malaika, who likes to say she was conceived in Tanzania, but born over here.
The idea came in Tanzania.
Right.
So when he left New York to join the movement, was his dad still alive?
Yes.
Okay. How
Yeah.
was that handled? Because he was taking care of him, right?
Yeah, I think he got him settled to a point. Like it took a couple of, I sort of glossed over a couple of years.
Got it, yeah.
But he got him settled, and his dad passed away while we were still in Tanzania. And I think it was the Carter administration, because of the organizing around the Vietnam War. The Carter administration pardoned all citizens, American citizens, who had either left the country or, dodged the draft. And so that's why we were able to come back.
Okay. Interesting. Do you know why? Did he ever tell you why he chose philosophy of math?
So he had a really strong spiritual bent. And I think when he was an undergrad, he thought he might go into religion.
Okay. Where was undergrad?
At Hamilton College, upstate New York. And then when he got his master's, he went to Harvard, and he was doing philosophy. And the premier or the lead philosopher in the philosophy of department was a logician. I guess, a mathematical logician. And so he was sort of going with, what was popular or what was the focus of the philosophy department at Harvard at that time. But I think he always liked math. He went to Stuyvesant High School in New York, and so my sense was that he just really excelled academically. And but that's a really good question.
Well, because because I'm thinking about I guess some of this stuff is like what you do in undergrad could kind of inform what you end up getting interested in, right? But it appeared to me, especially given the genesis of the algebra project and the YPP, that it wasn't just math for math, right? Like it became something else. And I just wondered if that thinking began all the way through the journey, right? That is something almost bigger he's trying to understand through these degrees.
I think so. I think he was always a deep thinker. I mean, my sense was that he was searching. When I learned, it's so funny how you learn things about your parents, like near the end that you
tell me about that.
Never knew.
Yeah.
But he used to come home when he was in college and do like sidewalk preaching.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, in New York.
Oh, wow.
I was like, what?
Wow.
So I think he definitely was searching for something. I mean, the choice to study philosophy, because you're really thinking about, like deep ideas about existence and meaning. And that he, like I said, he always had a very deep spiritual bent, and that found expression later in life when we were in Tanzania. Somebody gave him the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And he got really deep into that sort of philosophy of yoga and life, and practiced it a lot, especially, really, all through our childhood and early adulthood. And so he brought that that tendency to, he was always just really good at seeming to penetrate to like a really deep understanding of like the core of things.
Not just math, right?
Not just math. Right. Yeah, not just math.
So let me make sure I have my timelines right. He left the PhD program to join SNCC, right? Did he finish the PhD program before Tanzania, or
no?
So so that was finished after when you came back.
When we came back,
and so Harvard just like, oh yeah, we haven't seen you in a while. Do these 3 classes and wait.
Harvard, once you go, you can always come back. Apparently, yeah.
Is that still the case?
I think so. I do believe. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, it's very nice. So what was the time period then between leaving?
So it was like 1958. I think he left, and then he came back in 76.
Oh wow. Yeah. Okay. So so he gets a PhD in math, and I know him and the family are in Cambridge, Massachusetts. What led to Algebra Project? And not just he had a thing, right? But what made him sit and say, hey, this is the next mission that I need to sign up for?
So he didn't finish his PhD. He taught us math all through our childhood. So I think I remember like starting to work with him from the age of 3. And then when I was in the 8th grade, he thought I was ready to take algebra, and the school wasn't offering it. And I was really tired of working with him. So I would stonewall him a lot. So he just went around me and he made a deal with my teacher to come into my class and teach me algebra during math class, along with a few other students that she asked him to teach. And around the same time, it was roughly around the same time, he got the MacArthur Award. And so what he ran into in my algebra class or in my math class was that the students were sorted into ability groups, and those ability groups more or less fell along race and class lines.
Yeah.
And so his freedom struggle, button got pushed.
Right.
And also as a parent, because I was the oldest and, I had 3 siblings coming up behind me. And so he wanted to make sure they also got to take algebra and, were having a good math education in school. So I think that first year when I was in 8th grade, he was probably still doing his studies and then, coming in once a day. But after a while, he just started focusing on working with the students in the school and raising the question of, well, who gets to take algebra? And he started working with parents and talking to parents about what was going on, the other Black parents in the school. And one of the parents, her name was Shirley Kimbrough, she wrote a letter to the other parents, and the letter basically asked 2 questions. Do you want your child to take algebra? I think it was 7th and 8th grade. And do you want all the children to take algebra? And so all the parents said, yes, I want my child to do it. But not all the parents said that they wanted all the children to do it. And this was at the Open School, the King Open School in Cambridge.
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm familiar with it, but
yeah, where parents had a lot of influence, and so they made a policy decision based on what every parent wanted for their own child, and they decided that they would teach algebra to all children in this program within the school, in the King Open program, starting in the 7th grade. And so then the 6th grade teachers asked, well, how do we prepare our students to take algebra? Because they had been preparing them for more arithmetic, basically.
Right.
So he started working with the teachers and held some workshops, classes for teachers and parents. And then he organized some college students at Harvard, actually. I think they were I might get this wrong, but I think they were with an organization called the Seymour Society. And they came with him before school. He got some students and the college students to agree to come before school. And the college students were the attraction, because there was that, close in age or closer in age relationship, near peer, to try out some materials, to think about, how to prepare students differently. And so what he was working on was, as he started teaching the students in 7th and 8th grade algebra, what he noticed was that their metaphors about number that are so powerful for arithmetic, and they're like so obvious we don't pay attention to them, that numbers carry information about how much or how many, and that's our main metaphor that we have in our mind for what a number is, what a number represents. That metaphor breaks down when you get to algebra, because in algebra you encounter new numbers, different kinds of numbers, signed numbers, and that you need a metaphor which says, well, numbers are also telling you something about which way, right? They're capturing information about direction. And so this is where his work at Harvard around the philosophy of mathematics really started to flower, I would say, because he was looking at the work of a philosopher named Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine, who had a philosophy of elementary mathematics anyway, which said, roughly, I'm not going to say this technically.
This is not your dissertation defense. I think you'll be all right.
That mathematics is a structured, regimented language, and that these languages are sort of ubiquitous in the scientific disciplines, and that they arise from the language that people use to talk about their experiences, but they structure and regiment the way you can talk about them. So we're about the same height, right? I think
6'0".
Oh no, so you're taller. So right, in our everyday language, you'd say Brian is taller than Maisha. But math forces you to encode Brian's height is greater than Maisha's height. And so he, and that was actually an activity that he developed and put into the curriculum materials that he developed over a number of years to help students make that transition and have, one, to understand that math emerges from everyday experiences. It's just a matter of paying attention to certain features of those experiences and then naming them and then structuring the language that you use, right? It forces you to use a certain language, right? Certain syntax to talk about those experiences. And so that was the work that he was doing with students before school. And then after about a year, he felt like he had a set of materials that he could actually take into the classroom. And it was Lynn Godfrey, who was a 5th and 6th grade teacher, I think. She agreed to test the materials in her classroom. And so, again, over a number of years, he worked very closely with her to, develop and iterate and modify. And then, I don't know, that was about a 5-year period. And it took, I guess, that amount of time to sort of solidify the process. And that turned into what the Algebra Project called the transition curriculum based on the 5-step process. Which is, you start with some sort of physical event. Like comparing heights is a very simple physical event. Another sort of the culminating the beginning physical event was taking a trip on the Red Line. And then
in Boston.
Yes. But you can take a trip.
You may have your own local Red Line.
Exactly. You can take a trip in a car. But a trip gives rise to certain mathematical features, and the students would go through a process of drawing pictures about their trip, making a mural, writing stories about the trip. And in that part of the process, everybody has a voice because everybody has something to say about their experience. Everybody owns their experience. And so it's a way for people to feel like they have a say in the mathematics, right? They're contributing to the creation of a little bit of mathematical knowledge. And so then, once you have that that process. And the other thing about that process of giving students a voice, one of the things that, and this is sort of jumping back to the 60s and, what it took, one of the tools that the young SNCC workers used to organize the sharecroppers was a meeting, and figuring out how to structure meetings so that the people who come actually talk and don't just sit and listen to a person or a panel of people. Exactly. Right, and who are willing to bring their ideas to the table. And so his metaphor for classrooms was that they're a kind of a meeting space, but typically the teacher is the one who's talking and telling students, what to think about and how to think about it. And so he was really searching for a process in the mathematical space, in the mathematical education space, that enabled people to really have a voice in the classroom and students. And so then students talk about a whole lot of things, many of them not necessarily related to, quote unquote, the math, or what people might think is the math. But then out of all of that conversation, it turns out that there's a few sort of often really obvious features that you could focus on. And then once you focus on them, you can mathematize them.
Right.
And so that was the 5-step process. So having the event, drawing a picture, talking about the event in people talk, identifying the mathematical features, and creating the feature talk to relate those features, and then representing the features symbolically. And this is where it really becomes clear that math is a language, because the symbolic representation is just a translation of the feature talk into symbols. The meaning is really encoded in the feature talk.
Well, one of the things that I like about the way that method's set up is sometimes, even when you're learning a new language, but I would say particularly in college, math classrooms, science classrooms, is there is almost an understanding or belief that you have to sort of check whoever you are door before you enter into this new universe, this new culture, right? Because now you're doing science, right? Now you're doing math, and you have to, think like a mathematician, and you have to, and there's a lot of work on identity, sense of belonging and identity in these subjects. And I'm not here against that research, but one of the struggles I have with it is sometimes, to me, it presumes that the thing that you're trying to identify with itself does need interrogation, right? And and that you need to sort of shape shift whatever you brought to the table in order to accede, right, to this thing. But here this method is saying, your daily experience matters as you acclimatize, as you decide kind of how you want to exist in this new mathematical world, because your world is part of that world too, right? Absolutely.
And in that sense, it opens the world up to you, because then you learn how to you can learn how to relate your experience to anything.
Right. And then, the other thing too, not to bash academia too hard here, but sometimes a lot of we have terms for these things now, right? Community, cultural wealth, active learning, and I think it's good, terms kind of codify an understanding of something, but sometimes the naive among us don't realize that a lot of these things were existing. And they may not have been called that, but the mentality of where people come from matter, people having agency matter. These things existed long before we applied academic terms to it.
Yes.
Yeah. So Algebra Project, was in existence. What was the year it was founded?
83.
83, okay.
Yeah, 83, and then it sort of formalized as an organization in the early 90s, 1991.
Okay. But then Young People's Project, the organization which you are an executive director of, formed in 1996.
Yes.
What were the conditions that led to that founding?
Yeah. So my dad invited my brothers and some of his...
You better don't say no.
Yeah, my brothers, and like we had this sort of extended all of the black children who went to the open school, right, who were part of the algebra project. We sort of formed an extended family network. And so we were all in our 20s then. And my brothers were in their early 20s, and, some of my cousins, extended family cousins, and former algebra project students were in their early 20s. And they were all boys. My sister and I were the only girls.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
I have no idea. Yeah, I have no idea. All these civil rights mothers who wanted to have boys to be the next generation, right? Yeah. My mother was one of those mothers. But I always tell her she's really lucky she didn't have all boys.
I have all boys, so I'll see what happens in my situation. So you all were in your 20s.
We were in our 20s, and so my dad was inviting my brothers and cousins down to Mississippi to check out the work that he was doing with the algebra project. So he had gone back to Mississippi. He and Dave Dennis, who had co-directed Freedom Summer together in 1964. And they would meet up, at various SNCC reunions. And he would talk about the algebra project. And he convinced Dave that this issue, the issue of really underlying it is quality education for all children, right, but organizing around access to math as a way to get at that issue was sort of the civil rights struggle of this time. And so Dave moved his family. He had been in Louisiana, and he moved his family to Mississippi. To help get the algebra project off the ground in Mississippi. And they felt like they had work undone there. They had left work unfinished. And so he had sort of put his bucket down at Brinkley Middle School in Jackson. And he was working with some 7th graders, and then he followed them to 8th grade.
And just real quick, I know your use of the word bucket. I don't think that was an accident.
Oh, yeah, there's a... I just got this from growing up here.
Cash your bucket where you are.
Cash your bucket
right?
where you are.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted the audience to know that. So
yeah.
We'll explain it afterwards, but you can continue.
Yeah.
Like what it means.
Yeah. So then my brothers went down, and they just and they were helping out in the classroom, and they just made these incredible relationships with the students. And again, it's that near peer connection. I mean, they're in their early 20s. These students are in middle school. They automatically think they're cool, and they were pretty cool. And my dad was really pushing them because he would keep telling them, as my brother Omo likes to say, that my dad kept telling them that the young people have to get their act together. And part of what he was saying was that, at least how I interpret it, was that the problem requires youth agency in order to shift. That the idea that the country as a whole has, which is that education sort of, my dad used to call it, he called it sharecropper education, the idea that your pre-assigned work, and then you get the education to prepare you for that work to which you've been pre-assigned.
And by work, you mean there's an assumption of this is the limits of your capability. And so the work that you're assigned is congruent with what people assume your capability is. And so therefore the preparation is in preparation for that low limit.
Exactly. That's the expression today. He ran into it in Mississippi with sharecroppers, right? And when you have, a caste system, essentially, and it's not the expectation of what you're capable of, it's
Right.
the expectation of what you're allowed.
What they need from you.
And
right?
what they need from you, right.
Yeah.
And but even today, so you had in the early 1990s a case in New York and the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, and they sued New York State, and they said students in New York City on average have they graduate with 8th grade skills, and we're at the dawn of the 21st century, and so what can you do with 8th grade skills? And one of the justices really just like sort of put into, not into his law, but into his opinion, exactly what you just said, right? That, well, we need children to fill low-wage jobs, and you can do that with an 8th grade education. And we need a lot of people, actually, right, to fill these low-wage jobs. And I think this is really a conundrum for the country. And given the country's history, it doesn't give all children an equal opportunity to fill low-wage jobs, right? It sorts that opportunity again along race and class lines. And so in the face of that, what do young people do, right? In the face of this system, which in the words of Ella Baker really does not lend itself to their needs, to their hopes, their desires for fulfilling whatever dreams they have for their lives. What do they do? And so that's what he was saying when he said the young people have to get their act together, because the story is, of course, all the way down the line from everybody in the school system. When the students are not performing, well, it's because they're not behaving, they're not showing up, right? They really don't care about their education. And so they started the Young People's Project. And the students, I think, were willing to do that because in the algebra project, they experienced a way of learning in which they found themselves. Right? So the whole part of the 5-step process, which enables you to bring yourself and your voice to the classroom, your experiences have meaning, they count. It just really opened themselves up, primarily to themselves and then also to each other. And so they had those, they just had such a different kind of learning experience. And then my dad was also helping them have experiences outside of the classroom. And so he enabled them to go to a graphing calculator workshop, and they learned the graphing calculator, and they picked it up much more quickly than the teachers picked it up. And so then they had a little bit of like intellectual capacity that had value, because this was the very early days of school starting to use the graphing calculators. And so because they had gotten that training, then when in the summer, I think this was the summer of 95 maybe, when they came back to school that next school year, then they started helping the teacher teach the other students the graphing calculator. And that sense of power, that like we can really learn something and make a difference, I think also gave rise to the idea that they could form something that was their own, and that it was a real thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's like my son now teaching me things on my own iPhone, right? It's all embarrassing.
Exactly.
You're 10 minutes. It's not okay. So right now the model is students who were algebra project participants, like who were in classrooms that were taught algebra, they now go into middle schools and teach middle school age children algebra.
Yes.
Did I have that right?
Yeah. So The way it works now is that we have high school, sometimes college students who also support the high school students. They go either to the school during the school day or after school, and they teach algebra concepts. So one of the things that YPP did early on was that they focused on games and some of the games that they had learned in the algebra project, and expanding those games. And then also there was a really powerful game that my dad developed called the Flagway game, which he sort of handed over to YPP to fully develop. Because games are things that children just naturally do with each other. It's just part of youth culture. And so they organize that, and for the purpose of doing math together.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I did note at the beginning of this conversation how you described what YPP does and why, right? In a very non-deficit way, in the sense, I can't remember the exact words, but he talked about there are students who are in conditions that don't allow them to thrive, right?
Yeah.
And that's in keeping with, what we've come to understand about sharecropper education and things like that. And so I appreciate that, because I think even people who are, relatively progressive in their values and how they think about education still don't quite, get that systems and environments is what we need to focus on.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
However, YPP is set up to go in and create community and foster intellectual and social growth.
Yeah.
Is any component of YPP set up to address the environment that is causing the problem in the first place?
Yeah. That's a good question. So YPP is a little bit over 25 years young. I can't believe it. And the first part of it is, are the young people willing to put a demand on themselves, do the work? And so we've shown that that's true. And as we've built a track record, more and more we've been invited to partner with systems. And that's a really interesting development. One, it's amazing, because YPP is not a kind of strategy which is focused on protest.
Right.
Right? It's a strategy that says, well, you have to go after your education. You have to go after that which you might want to not engage in because of the dysfunctional ways in which it's being presented to you. And you have to figure out how to get your friends and your peers to also go after it.
Yeah.
And so it's taken a really long time for just a handful of schools and school systems to see that as valuable.
The going after.
The going after, and to invest in the young people themselves as the agents of change to get other young people to go after it, right? Schools are designed, the model really for all schools is that it's the adults who are the agents to get the students and to get the children to move and to do something and to do whatever it is that they're doing in school. But for the students at the bottom, right, the system isn't designed for them to move up. So really they just have each other, I think.
Right.
But then is the system, are schools willing to organize themselves so that the students can actually have each other, right? Schools
And by organize, you mean like restructure the system that allows that.
Exactly.
Right? That requires a whole change in mentality.
It's a big change.
It's not even just about doing 3 or 4 things. It's like you have to actually rethink, what does it mean to educate in this establishment? Right?
Exactly. And you have to emphasize more collaborative achievement. Education is so focused, it's so competitive, focused on individual achievement. So schools aren't really places that are designed for children to help
Right.
each other. And that's the core of our strategy,
Right.
that the children have to help each other.
Right. And I just, I just think about what that means for not just their math skills, but just the values that they will hold going forward as citizens, as voters, as parents, as community members, as church members, right? And that I guess maybe selfishly for me, that's the kind of long view piece that I just feel education is missing so much
Yes.
is how you kind of formatively expose people to the environment and values now.
Yes.
That when they get to be 25, 30, 35, whatever, like they take that with them.
Yes.
And the math skills too, right?
Yes.
But that bigger piece, that civic piece.
Yes. They have to practice all of those citizenship skills
Right.
as children, and it's beyond behaving.
Right. well, yeah. I mean, actually, you say you laugh, and I agree with you because behaving, not just behaving in the sense that you want, I don't know, an orderly classroom or whatever, but sometimes behaving can be a synonym for acquiescence, maybe.
Yes.
Right. Like
Yes.
they don't question.
Yes.
Right. You're just in a space, and this is what it is, and your job is to acquiesce and agree.
Yes.
And so this is me extrapolating from your use of the word behaving, and
Yes.
it's powerful once you start thinking beyond that.
Yes. Yeah. No. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let me circle back, speaking of philosophy, to the phrase I called you out on. And I learned it myself from Radical Equations. Cash your bucket where you are.
Yeah.
It's a phrase I've used now a lot when I give talks, when I do professional development, partly because in education research, I would say maybe in research in general, sometimes there's an obsession with looking for patterns and what trends occur across the nation in certain things, which I think there's a place for that, right? But sometimes it prevents people from taking time to understand the uniqueness of the situation they're in, right? So to be specific to education, yes, there are certain teaching strategies that I feel very confident that can work in most classrooms. But in all the classrooms I've taught are different. Semester to semester, is like every time I teach a class, I approach it like a whole new class because I'm taking time to figure out who's in front of me, what are their histories, even if it's similar-ish to the last one. And then as we kind of build that relationship, I'm making decisions based on the evolution and the emergence of that relationship. Talk to us a little bit about that phrase, "Catch your bucket where you are," how it played out in the civil rights movement, and then how it played out in AP and YPP.
So I think it goes back to the idea from Ella Baker that leaders are everywhere. And so wherever you are, if you just sort of, it's like a perfect metaphor. It's not about stopping. It's about choosing to go deep in a place with the people who are there in that place.
Right.
And facing the problems that arise that you choose to work on together, and then figuring out together how to work on those problems.
I want to take that quote you just said, the one I interrupted, and just apply that to every classroom. Like just exactly the way you just said that, right? Imagine if you thought of, no matter what class it is, imagine if you thought of it that way.
Yes.
Being willing to face a problem with the people who are there and going
Yes.
deeply into that.
Yes. No, that's it. And similar to what you were just talking about, you experience at the university level, I mean, I've heard it a lot recently that one of the big problems that teachers are facing is that from period to period, even if it's the same class, it's not the same.
Right.
It's different. And within one class, you have students, especially in middle school, who are at very different levels, maybe like 3 to 4 to 5 years of, so-called performance levels in terms of grade. and their skills. But that's actually a wonderful problem to have if you approach it from this perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess 25 years young, and even if you were to add on the AP years to that, both organizations have lived in America during very, very different political times. So without going into too much detail about, where we are right now, but I just want to know kind of in general, how you've cast your bucket where you were in different states, in different situations, in different environments, and maybe even as you look to the future, where do you see the next directions for YPP going?
Yeah, so YPP got off the ground because Omo really cast his bucket in Mississippi. And, I mean, it was my brothers and like eighth graders, and they started YPP. And for the first 5 years of the organization's life, it was just exactly that, like figuring out what that group of young people and the other young people they attracted could do together. And that expression of cast your bucket where you are gave birth to YPP.
Okay.
Which has now had, a national footprint. We've been able to sustain projects for bursts of time in different places all over the country. And so that's why I know that there are young people pretty much in every community, in the communities that we want to focus in, who find just really deep meaning in doing this work. I think the other place that we've been able to sustain a footprint around this idea of cast your bucket where you are is here in Boston, Boston and Cambridge. And so now this is our longest running site.
Right.
And I think it's required keeping the local presence, but then having building national influence to get to the point over the years where now we're able to sit down, like say with Cambridge Public School Districts, and talk about how we might build out YPP in the schools, in more schools. And as we just talked about, it's not, schools have to shift, and it's a big shift. But that they're willing to have that conversation is just really, really big. But it's taken all these years to get there.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a while. I think a lot of times people ask me about, and this is in the college transformation of teaching kind of context about, how do you go about getting people to think about their teaching differently and transform the institution? And my first word is always patience, man.
Yeah.
This stuff mightn't happen the way we want it. I hate to say it in our lifetimes or in our careers, but you kind of have to work towards that more perfect union type of mentality, and also be willing to look back and say, we are in a better place now than we were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? Hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it definitely takes patience.
Yeah. Are your brothers still involved in YPP?
No. My brother Omo has started a different organization. It's called Math Talk. And he's looking at augmented reality as a tool to help make visible the math and the environment that's around us. And then also thinking about like installations that in public places to help adults and children just engage in math playfully, right, as they going around their
really
neighborhood.
Cool.
Yeah, it's cool.
That's cool.
And then my other brother, Taba, ended up getting into construction. Yeah. And my sister, she had done some work with the Algebra Project in YPP also, and she was in high school and a little bit in college. And she ended up going to business school. She went to Babson and has worked in various nonprofits. Yeah.
It's interesting because we're recording this episode at Bentley, which is, I think, Babson's like direct competitor.
Sorry.
I don't apologize. It's just kind of funny. Hey, man, we could talk for hours, but there's so much to unpack with this work, but it's been great. I really think the audience learned a lot and will continue to learn. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Say what it be. I know the king, follow his lead, repeat after me. I know they lurking, this serpent is circling, but I never...
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who has supported all of our episodes. Our producer, once again, Mr. Segev Amasai, Computer Engineering Major, Class of 2025. Our content manager, I should have said this in previous episodes, Mr. Adrian Lozano, Biology Major, Class of 2026. You can find this on every episode on Spotify, iHeartRadio, or you can go straight to our website at knowledgeunbound.transistor.fm. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks to our guest, Maisha Moses, Executive Director of the Young People's Project. Thanks for everything that she has shared with us. And I hope that one of the lessons that you take from this, and I guess maybe for me, is figure out how to catch your bucket. This is something you may have to reflect on. What does it mean to go deeply into a problem with your students? What does it mean to get to know them and be in community with them in service of that problem? It's a completely different way of teaching, but it comes from a movement that asks us to just be better humans to each other. So with that, I'll see you next week. And don't forget, be excellent to each other.
You gotta move, but ain't gotta prove that you out in the front. You do what you do when you ain't gotta stunt. Cause humble is up and the proud gotta punt. 4th and 10, if you wanna win.
It's not about stopping. It's about choosing to go deep in a place with the people who are there in that place. And facing the problems that arise that you choose to work on together, and then figuring out together